December 28, 1999, Louisiana State Penitentiary. Blood covers the floor of a prison bathroom. A corrections officer lies dead, beaten with a hammer, stabbed multiple times. 5 convicted murderers. 1 brutal killing. A cover-up that would cost American taxpayers $14 million. Tonight, you'll hear the real story of Angola's most dangerous inmates and the murder that exposed how broken our justice system really is. This isn't another prison story. This is about 5 men who thought they could escape America's most secure prison, and the guard who paid the ultimate price for their freedom. What happened in that bathroom changed everything, and what prosecutors did afterward will shock you even more. But first, let me know in the comments where you're watching from right now. Are you in Louisiana? Have you ever heard of Angola Prison before tonight? Drop your location below. I read every single comment, and I'm curious to see how far this story reaches. To understand what happened that December night, you need to know about Louisiana State Penitentiary. Most people call it Angola, and there's a reason it strikes fear into the hearts of criminals across America. 18,000 acres. That's bigger than Manhattan. This isn't some small county jail. This is a fortress in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the Mississippi River and endless swampland. Angola houses over 6,000 inmates, the worst of the worst. Murderers, rapists, armed robbers, men who will never see freedom again. 29% of the beds are reserved for maximum security prisoners, the ones too dangerous for anywhere else. The prison sits on what used to be a slave plantation. The name Angola comes from the country where many of those slaves originated. Even today, inmates work the fields under armed guards on horseback, just like their ancestors did over a century ago. This place has always been known for violence, riots, murders, escape attempts. Angola earned its nickname as America's bloodiest prison through decades of brutality. In the 1990s, when our story takes place, it was still a powder keg waiting to explode. The main entrance sits at the end of a winding, muddy road. Once you pass through those gates, you're 30 miles from the nearest town. There's no fence around the entire property, because there's nowhere to run. The swamps and the river make sure of that. But on December 28, 1999, 5 men thought they could beat the system. They thought they could escape from America's most secure prison. They were wrong, and a good man died because of their arrogance. Captain David Knapps was 49 years old, a dedicated corrections officer who'd spent years keeping Angola's most dangerous criminals in line. He had no idea that December 28th would be his last day alive. At 8:30 that evening, the education building in Camp D became a war zone. 3 guards were taken hostage, weapons appeared from nowhere, and in a small bathroom, Captain Knaps was beaten to death with a hammer and stabbed repeatedly. But here's what makes this case so disturbing. 5 men were involved in this murder, yet decades later, we still don't know who delivered the fatal blow. The prosecutors think they know, the courts think they know, but one confession will change everything you think about this case. Let me tell you about the 5 killers, each one already serving life in prison for murder, each one with nothing left to lose. The first killer, 39 years old, already on death row for murdering his co-worker during an armed robbery. By 1999, he'd been locked up for 15 years, and his appeals were running out. The second killer, 26 years old, shot a man just months after getting out on parole. Young, angry, and serving life without the possibility of parole. The third killer, 23 years old, the youngest of the group, convicted of strangling his 62-year-old adoptive grandmother with an electric blanket cord on Valentine's Day. Court records show he was involved in satanic worship and had a disturbing fascination with the occult. The fourth killer, 39 years old, shot a man twice in a parking lot. He'd been in Angola for 14 years, watching his life slip away behind bars. And finally, the mastermind, 31 years old. A gas station robber who murdered the attendant in cold blood. But here's what makes him different. He'd already escaped from prison once before, when he was just 17. The mastermind spent weeks studying the prison's daily routines. He watched the guards, he memorized their schedules, and he found something that would change everything: a weakness in the education building. Camp D's education building was supposed to be secure. Inmates could only access certain areas with proper authorization. But the mastermind discovered something the guards didn't know. He could manipulate the call-out sheets. These sheets determined which inmates could go where and when. The mastermind started adding names, changing schedules, creating opportunities that shouldn't exist. He was rewriting the rules, and nobody noticed. While he worked on access, the others were gathering weapons. A small hammer disappeared from the maintenance shop. Pieces of metal were sharpened into knives. These men were preparing for war, right under the guards' noses. They picked December 28th for a reason: evening shift, fewer guards on duty, the education building would be quieter. Perfect conditions for what they had planned. The mastermind briefed each man on his role. The first killer would coordinate the attack. The young one would help control the hostages. The parolee would handle the physical work. The hammerman would strike first and strike hard. Everything was ready. 5 killers, multiple weapons. A detailed plan that had taken weeks to perfect. At 8:30 p.m., their plan would turn deadly. 8:30 p.m., December 28, 1999. The education building in Camp D was quiet. 3 corrections officers were on duty, completely unaware they were walking into a trap. Captain David Knapps, 49 years old, a veteran officer who'd seen everything Angola had to offer. Sergeant Redio Walker, Lieutenant Douglas Cheney, 3 dedicated guards, about to become hostages. The attack began without warning. The hammerman stepped out of the shadows and swung his weapon with deadly force. The first blow caught Captain Knaps in the head. Blood exploded across the hallway. Chaos erupted. The other inmates moved fast. Sergeant Walker was grabbed. Lieutenant Cheney was surrounded. Within seconds, 3 trained corrections officers were overpowered by 5 desperate killers. But Captain Knaps was hurt bad. The hammer had cracked his skull. Blood was pouring down his face. He was staggering, trying to stay on his feet, trying to protect his fellow officers. That's when the parolee made his move. He grabbed the bleeding captain and started dragging him across the floor. A trail of blood marked their path as they headed toward a small bathroom at the end of the hallway. The mastermind was barking orders. The education building was theirs. 3 hostages were under control. The escape was actually working. But something changed in that bathroom. Something that would turn a prison break into a murder case that would haunt Louisiana for decades. The parolee pulled Captain Knaps inside. The door closed. And for the next several minutes, only they know what really happened in there. Inside that small bathroom, Captain Knaps fought for his life. Even with a cracked skull and blood pouring from his wounds, he refused to give up. The killers wanted his keys, but he wouldn't surrender them. What happened next was brutal beyond description. The hammer came down again and again. Homemade knives found their target. In that confined space, a good man was beaten and stabbed to death by killers who had nothing left to lose. Captain Knaps could have saved himself. All he had to do was hand over those keys. But he knew what those keys meant. More violence, more chaos, maybe more dead guards. So he held on, even as his life slipped away. Outside the bathroom, the other hostages could hear everything. The sounds of violence, the desperation. They knew their colleague was dying, and they couldn't do anything to save him. Meanwhile, prison officials were mobilizing. Armed guards surrounded the education building. Negotiators tried to make contact, but the killers weren't interested in talking. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The siege lasted for hours. 5 killers holding 2 remaining hostages. 1 dead guard in a blood-soaked bathroom. And outside, an army of corrections officers waiting for the order to move in. When that order finally came, the shooting was swift and deadly. The 6th member of the group, a killer who had joined them at the last minute, was cut down by gunfire. He died instantly. The other 5 surrendered. The hostages were freed. Captain Knaps was found in that bathroom, beaten beyond recognition. Just like that, the Angola 5 were born. 5 surviving killers who had murdered a corrections officer in cold blood. 5 men who would spend the next 2 decades in court, fighting for their lives. The crime scene told a story written in blood. Captain Knaps had fought hard, but he'd been overwhelmed by superior numbers and brutal weapons. The evidence was everywhere. Blood spatter on the walls, DNA on the weapons, and most damning of all, blood all over the parolee's clothing. His pants, his shoes, even his underwear was soaked with Captain Knaps' blood. Laboratory tests confirmed what investigators already knew. The blood belonged to the victim. The DNA was a perfect match. The parolee had been in that bathroom when Captain Knaps died, and the evidence was literally all over him. But here's where the case gets complicated. During the siege, Angola's legendary warden Burl Kane made a decision that would haunt this case for decades. He wrote a handwritten note promising the killers immunity if they would surrender without harming the remaining hostages. The note was specific. No charges, no official reports, no consequences for what had already happened. It was signed by the warden and by some of the killers themselves. The problem? Captain Knaps was already dead when that note was written. The warden didn't know it yet, but he was offering immunity for a murder that had already been committed. Defense attorneys would argue for years that this note was a binding agreement. Prosecutors would claim it was worthless, written under duress and without knowledge of the full situation. 4 years passed before the Angola 5 were finally charged with murder. 4 years of investigations. 4 years of legal maneuvering. 4 years for evidence to disappear and memories to fade. When the trials finally began, prosecutors were confident. They had DNA evidence. They had witnesses. They had a clear case of 5 killers murdering a guard during an escape attempt. But prosecutors were hiding something that would change everything. Trend. 4 years. That's how long it took for the Angola 5 to finally face trial for Captain Knaps' murder. 4 years of legal delays, evidence gathering, and political maneuvering. 4 years while 5 killers sat in their cells, knowing that death row was waiting. The trials began in 2011. Each killer would face court separately, each one fighting for his life. The death penalty was on the table for all 5, and prosecutors intended to use it. The first killer to face trial was the one already on death row for his previous murder. The man who had coordinated the attack. His trial was swift and brutal. The jury heard the evidence. They saw the crime scene photos. They listened to testimony about his role in planning the escape. The verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence, death. For the second time in his life, this killer was condemned to die. The court had spoken. Justice would be served. Next came the parolee, the one whose clothes were soaked in Captain Knaps' blood, the one who had dragged the dying guard into that bathroom. His trial was even more damning. DNA evidence, blood spatter analysis, witness testimony placing him at the scene. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty of first-degree murder. Death sentence. Another killer headed to death row. Another step toward justice for Captain Knaps. But then something unexpected happened. The mastermind's trial didn't go as planned. The jury found him guilty, but they couldn't agree on the death penalty. 10 jurors wanted him executed. 2 refused. Under Louisiana law, the death penalty requires unanimous agreement. Deadlock. Life without parole. The man who planned the whole escape, who manipulated the system, who made it all possible, would spend the rest of his life in prison, but he wouldn't die for his crimes. The hammerman faced the same result, guilty of first-degree murder, but his jury also deadlocked on the death penalty. 9 jurors wanted him executed, 3 said no, another life sentence, another killer escaping the ultimate punishment. And the youngest killer? He never went to trial at all. His lawyers negotiated a plea deal, guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for life without parole. He avoided the risk of execution, but he would never see freedom again. 5 killers, 2 death sentences, 3 life sentences, but the story was far from over, because prosecutors had been hiding a secret that would call everything into question. The trials were over. The appeals had begun. 2 men sat on death row for Captain Knaps's murder. Justice seemed complete. But then an inmate named Richard Domingue came forward with information that would shake the entire case to its foundation. Domingue had been talking to the hammerman, the killer who had struck Captain Knaps with the first blow, and what the hammerman told him changed everything we thought we knew about that night. According to Domingue, the hammerman made a confession that prosecutors had known about for months, but had kept hidden from defense attorneys and the courts. The confession was simple and devastating. The hammerman admitted that during those final moments in the bathroom, a decision was made. Captain Knaps was already beaten. He was under control. The killers had what they wanted, but 2 of them, just 2, decided that wasn't enough. They could have let Captain Knaps live. They had him subdued. They could have tied him up and continued with their escape. The guard would have survived. Instead, they chose murder. The hammerman's exact words to Domingue were chilling. We could have let him live, but we made a decision to help ourselves and kill him instead. But here's the bombshell. The hammerman said that only he and the first killer, the one who had coordinated the attack, made that decision. The other 3 weren't part of it. They weren't involved in the choice to murder Captain Knaps. This confession pointed to 2 specific killers as the ones responsible for the decision to commit murder. But by the time this confession surfaced, the parolee, the one with blood all over his clothes, was already on death row. The prosecutors had known about this confession for months. They had interviewed Domingue. They had his statement on tape, but they didn't turn it over to defense attorneys until after the parolee's trial was complete. This is called prosecutorial misconduct. When prosecutors hide evidence that could help the defense, they violate the Constitution. They deny defendants their right to a fair trial. The parolee's lawyers were outraged. They filed appeals immediately. They demanded a new trial. They argued that this hidden confession proved their client was less involved in the murder than the jury had been told. Judge Jerome Winsberg agreed. He reviewed the evidence and made a stunning decision. He overturned the parolee's death sentence. The judge found that there was a reasonable probability the jury would have reached a different verdict if they had heard the confession. For a brief moment, it looked like justice might be served. The wrong man would be taken off death row. The real decision-makers would face the consequences, but the state appealed. Higher courts got involved. And in a controversial decision, the Louisiana Supreme Court reinstated the death sentence. They ruled that the hidden confession wasn't significant enough to change the outcome. Today, both the parolee and the first killer remain on death row. But the question haunts this case. Was the wrong man sentenced to death? 25 years have passed since Captain David Knapps was murdered in that Angola bathroom. 25 years of trials, appeals, and legal battles. And the bill for all of this? $14 million. $14 million of taxpayer money. Think about that for a moment. $14 million to prosecute 5 men who were already serving life in prison. Men who would never be free regardless of the outcome. Where did all that money go? Defense attorneys billing millions for expert witnesses, crime scene reconstructors, and mental health evaluations. Prosecutors flying in specialists from across the country. Court costs for multiple trials in different parishes. Security expenses for transporting dangerous inmates. One defense attorney alone billed $1.5 million over 5 years. The state paid hundreds of thousands to forensic experts. Even the jury expenses added up. Sequestered juries need hotels, meals, and security for weeks at a time. The appeals process has been equally expensive. Multiple trips to the Louisiana Supreme Court. Federal appeals that are still pending. Each legal brief costs thousands to prepare. Each hearing requires court reporters, guards, and administrative support. And the cases aren't over. More appeals are coming. More court dates are scheduled. The legal meter is still running. And taxpayers are still paying the bill. Some of the costs were almost absurd. Prosecutors spent over $700 on a single dinner after one conviction. Jurors were allowed 2 alcoholic drinks each night during sequestration. These details might seem small, but they add up when you're talking about multiple trials over many years. Louisiana lawmakers have been studying the death penalty specifically because of cases like this one. The state has the highest incarceration rate in the country. The criminal justice budget is stretched thin, and spending $14 million on 5 men who were already locked up for life has raised serious questions. The legal battles have reached the highest levels. Supreme Court justices have had to recuse themselves from the case after making public comments about the death penalty. The politics of capital punishment have infected what should have been a straightforward murder case. Meanwhile, the first killer and the parolee sit on death row, Jeffrey Cameron Clark and David Brown. After all these years, after all this money, after all these appeals, they're still waiting to learn if Louisiana will follow through on their death sentences. The other 3 killers, Robert Carley, Barry Edge, and David Mathis, continue serving life sentences at Angola. They work in the fields. They sleep in their cells. They wait to die of old age behind bars. Captain David Knapps is still dead. His family still grieves, and justice, well, that depends on who you ask. 25 years have passed since that December night in Angola. 25 years of trials, appeals, and unanswered questions. Captain David Knapps was murdered. But was true justice ever served? 2 men sit on death row for his killing. But a hidden confession suggests that only 2 specific killers made the decision to murder Captain Knaps, and one of those men is serving life in prison while another man faces execution. $14 million spent. Countless hours in courtrooms, political battles over the death penalty, prosecutorial misconduct that may have sent the wrong man to death row. This case has exposed every flaw in our criminal justice system. In 2025, Louisiana resumed executions after a 15-year pause. The state is once again putting condemned prisoners to death. Jeffrey Clark and David Brown remain on death row, waiting to learn if they will be among the next to face lethal injection. But questions remain. Did the right men get death sentences? Was the confession that prosecutors tried to hide the key to understanding what really happened in that bathroom? Will justice ever truly be served for Captain David Knapps? Maybe the most troubling question of all. If 5 men already serving life in prison can cost taxpayers $14 million and still leave us with more questions than answers, what does that say about our system of justice? Captain Knaps deserved better. His family deserved better. And maybe, just maybe, we all deserve better. Was justice truly served, or did the system fail? If you want to hear more stories like this one, stories that expose the dark truth about our criminal justice system, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because the truth is often more disturbing than fiction, and someone needs to tell these stories. Thanks for watching. Until next time.